Karen hurled a bottle at the man in the MAGA hat, confident in her righteousness. But his calm response revealed a truth that turned everything upside down, and her world came crashing down in an instant. On a bustling Manhattan street, where street performers blend their melodies with the blaring of taxi horns, and the aroma of freshly baked croissants conjures thoughts of morning coffee, stood Dan Harper. A 45-year-old man of average height, with streaks of gray in his hair and confidence in every movement. He casually shut the door of his old yet polished pickup truck. He wore a clean blue shirt tucked neatly into his worn but tidy jeans, and a red cap with the words "Make America Great Again" emblazoned across it, seemingly designed to attract stares from passers-by. Dan surveyed the street with a slight smile, taking in the city's morning chaos. His goal was simple: to make it to the trendy cafe on the corner and grab his favorite latte with a double shot of espresso. But his peaceful morning ritual was suddenly under threat. At the other end of the cafe stood Karen. She was impossible to miss. Around 40 years old, weighing approximately 375 pounds, dressed in leopard print leggings that were obviously too tight, and a bright pink t-shirt with the loud slogan, "Not My President." Her bleached blonde hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her face was adorned with a thin layer of makeup that only accentuated her perpetually displeased expression. In her hand, she clutched a latte cup, waving it around animatedly as she spoke to a friend, a thin woman with a frozen, polite smile that betrayed her unease. "These hats are a disgrace to this country," Karen declared loudly, punctuating her words with a dramatic hand gesture that sent a splash of latte onto the pavement. How can anyone openly support this circus? Dan, just about to cross the sidewalk to enter the cafe, suddenly found himself in her line of sight. Karen pivoted sharply, her eyes locking onto the red cap. She froze like a hunting dog catching a scent. Her face flushed with indignation and her voice rose. "Hey, you Republican clown," she yelled, pointing her latte cup toward Dan. "Do you think that hat makes you a patriot?" Her friend nervously glanced around but said nothing. The crowd of pedestrians began to slow, some turning their attention to the unfolding drama. Phones started to emerge from pockets. Dan paused and looked at Karen with a mix of mild surprise and a faint smirk. He adjusted his cap as though she had just pointed out it was crooked. "Just here for a morning coffee, ma'am," he said calmly, his voice devoid of aggression. Political debates are usually reserved for grown-up conversations. That comment, like a lit match tossed into dry grass, instantly ignited Karen's fury. Her face turned crimson, her lips pressed tight, and her latte cup creaked in her grip. "What did you just say?" she shouted, stepping forward. "You think you're better than everyone, huh? You're everything that's wrong with this country." The crowd buzzed with excitement. Some people laughed. Others whispered. A teenager nearby said loudly, "Best morning ever! Is anyone recording this?" Karen either didn't hear or chose to ignore the mocking comments. Her focus was entirely on Dan, who stood casually with his hands in his pockets, watching her with the amused expression of a teacher observing a particularly dramatic student. "Do you need something, ma'am?" he asked with exaggerated politeness. The measured tone of his words only added fuel to the fire. Karen's chest heaved with rage as she struggled to find the right words. Just then, the latte cup in her hand gave way under the pressure of her grip, spilling its contents onto her bright pink shirt with a soft pop. The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen slapped a hand over her mouth, attempting to maintain what was left of her dignity, but her face turned an even deeper shade of red. She furiously wiped at the coffee stains and glared at Dan. You'll regret this," she blurted out, though her words carried the weight of an empty threat. Dan nodded, still smiling. "Absolutely, but first, coffee." The crowd broke into applause. Someone shouted, "Legend!" Karen stood frozen, clearly searching for a comeback, but her friend gently tugged her arm, murmuring, "Maybe we should just go." The irony of the situation was clear to everyone except Karen. The scene ended with laughter and cheers, while Dan calmly stepped into the cafe as if nothing had happened. Karen stood on the sidewalk, her stance like that of a general preparing for battle. Her chest heaved, her face was red with fury, and her fists clenched as if ready to strike. She tossed the empty latte cup to the ground, its lid popping off and splattering the remaining contents as a symbol of her indignation. "Who do you even think you are?" she screamed, pointing at Dan's retreating figure as he stepped into the cafe. "Wearing that stupid hat in a decent place? You're a disgrace to this street." Some passers-by slowed their steps, eager to witness the spectacle. One person in the crowd quipped, "This is Manhattan. Is anything here even considered decent?" Unwilling to let the moment go, Karen stormed into the cafe after him. Once inside, she flailed her arms dramatically and shouted at the top of her lungs, "Do you see this man? He's threatening our safety with that hateful hat." Dan, now at the counter, acted as though he hadn't heard her. He glanced at the menu and calmly placed his order with the barista, a young man in his 20s who looked both confused and nervous. "A latte with a double shot of espresso, please. No sugar." Karen, undeterred, leaned on the counter, her leopard print leggings creaking ominously with the movement. "You can't serve him. That hat is a symbol of hate. You're obligated to kick him out." The barista froze, glancing nervously between Dan and Karen. Finally, he stammered, I just make coffee." The cafe began to fill with curious onlookers. People pulled out their phones to capture the drama. An elderly couple near the door whispered, "Do you think this is some kind of play?" Dan finally turned to Karen, his gaze calm and his lips curved in a subtle smile. "Ma'am," he said with the tone of someone addressing a tantrum-throwing child, "maybe you should drink some water. Emotions aren't great advisors." The words were like a match to gasoline. Karen grabbed a water bottle from the counter and, with a shriek, hurled it toward Dan. The bottle missed, hitting the espresso machine instead, and sending water splashing everywhere with a loud hiss. The crowd gasped, and someone murmured, "This just got real." Dan shook his head slightly, like a disappointed parent. "You've not only crossed the line, ma'am, but you've also ruined a perfectly good coffee machine." His calmness was salt in the wound. Karen stepped closer, but the barista, clearly realizing things had spiraled out of control, hesitantly said, "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'll have to call the police." The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Cameras zoomed in. Karen froze, her gaze darting between the barista and Dan. Her face twisted in frustration, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Call them," she screamed, pointing at Dan. "I'll tell them how this man is ruining my peace with his hateful propaganda." At that moment, the cafe door opened, and a young man with a camera stepped inside. "This is all going online," he announced loudly. "Your screaming performance is about to go viral on TikTok." The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen turned pale as she noticed the cameras. "This isn't funny," she yelled, though her voice was losing its conviction. Dan, now holding his latte, turned back to her with a serene expression. "Thanks for the morning entertainment, ma'am, but I prefer my coffee without drama." The crowd laughed and clapped. Karen stomped her foot and muttered something under her breath, her face a mixture of humiliation and fury. Little did she know, the day was about to take an even more unexpected turn. The water bottle Karen had thrown with the conviction of someone utterly sure of her righteousness missed Dan and hit the wall with a dull thud. Water splattered onto the floor, drawing the attention of every patron in the cafe. The manager, a man in his early 50s, dressed in a tailored suit with a professional smile that rarely left his face, even in moments of chaos, sighed heavily. Reaching for his phone, he said curtly, "We're calling the police." Karen, oblivious to his words, continued her tirade. "That hat is a symbol of hate. How can you tolerate him in here? Republicans are destroying this country." Dan, ignoring her outbursts, took a calm sip of his latte, as if he were at the theater rather than the epicenter of a public spectacle. Meanwhile, the crowd near the cafe entrance continued to grow, their phones pointed at Karen and her flushed, enraged face. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and 2 police officers entered. A tall, broad-shouldered man and his partner, a young woman with a resolute expression. They surveyed the scene, taking in Karen's flushed face and wild gestures as she yelled. "You're just in time," Karen exclaimed, pointing at Dan as if identifying a fugitive. "That man is threatening me with his presence. He's assaulting me with that awful hat. This is harassment." The officers exchanged glances, clearly fighting to suppress their amusement. The female officer stepped forward and asked, "Ma'am, harassment? Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Karen stomped her foot. "You need to arrest him for provocation." The male officer turned to Dan, who stood calmly, holding his coffee in one hand and casually adjusting his cap with the other. "Sir," the officer asked with a slight nod, "do you want to press charges?" Dan, unhurried, reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a leather case. Opening it, he revealed an official badge. The female officer's face grew serious, and the male officer raised an eyebrow slightly. The badge clearly read, "Federal Judge, U.S. District Court." The crowd buzzed with excitement. Whispers spread like wildfire. "He's a judge? Oh, this just got interesting." Dan calmly closed the badge case and addressed the officers. "I don't think pressing charges will be necessary, but perhaps a reminder to the lady about the legal consequences of slander and assault would be appropriate." Karen froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her once flushed face began to pale as she noticed for the first time the dozens of cameras pointed at her. You're a judge?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Dan responded with a faint smile. "As I said, ma'am, emotions are poor advisors." The crowd burst into laughter. One onlooker shouted, "This is the best show of the year." The male officer turned to Karen with a stern expression. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, we'll have to detain you for disturbing the peace." This is a misunderstanding," Karen stammered, desperation creeping into her voice as she tried to salvage her dignity. The female officer couldn't hold back a quiet snort, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. Karen shot her a glare, but it was clear she had lost control of the situation. Dan, still holding his coffee, gave the officers a slight nod of appreciation. "Thank you for your quick response. I hope this morning hasn't been too disrupted by this incident." He walked toward the exit but paused at the door. Turning back to Karen, he added, "Next time, ma'am, before throwing bottles, you might want to check who you're dealing with." The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. Karen stood motionless, like a statue, her face frozen in an expression of utter humiliation. This was a morning she would not soon forget. As the laughter and applause faded, Karen remained frozen, her face an unreadable mask of shock and indignation. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some still chuckling, others whispering animatedly about the scene they had just witnessed. Phones were lowered, but many people were already typing furiously, undoubtedly sharing the story on social media. Dan walked out of the cafe, latte in hand, and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. His posture was relaxed, his expression serene, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He adjusted his red cap once more, a faint smirk crossing his face as he noticed a few passers-by giving him curious glances. Inside the cafe, Karen struggled to regain her composure. Her friend, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, leaned in and whispered urgently, "Karen, let's just go, it's over." Karen's face flushed with renewed anger as she snapped, "It's not over. I won't let him humiliate me like this." The cafe manager, still holding his phone, approached cautiously, his professional smile still firmly in place. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This establishment reserves the right to refuse service to anyone causing a disturbance." Karen turned on him, her voice dripping with indignation. "Disturbance? I was defending our democracy against that MAGA hat-wearing menace, and you're kicking me out?" The manager's smile didn't waver as he responded, "Ma'am, you're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to disrupt our business or threaten our customers. Please leave, or I'll have to ask the officers to escort you out." Karen's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. But the weight of the morning's events, combined with the dozens of cameras that had captured her outburst, finally seemed to sink in. She grabbed her bag, muttered something incomprehensible under her breath, and stormed out of the cafe, her friend trailing behind her. As Karen stepped outside, she was greeted by a group of onlookers who had been waiting, their phones still recording. A few people clapped mockingly, others jeered. "Hey, Karen," someone shouted. "How's it feel to be famous?" Another chimed in, "Can't wait to see this on TikTok." Karen's face burned with humiliation. She hurried down the street, her friend struggling to keep up. "This isn't over," Karen muttered to herself, gripping her bag tightly. "I'll make him regret this." Meanwhile, Dan had moved on to the corner of the street, savoring his latte as he watched the city come alive. A young man approached him, phone in hand, and asked, "Hey, man, that was epic. Are you really a judge?" Dan chuckled softly. "Let's just say I've had some experience with handling unreasonable people." The young man grinned. "Dude, you're gonna go viral. That was legendary." Dan gave a polite nod, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Glad I could provide some entertainment. Have a good day." As the young man walked away, Dan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a flood of notifications, texts, emails, and even a few news alerts. One of the headlines caught his eye. "Karen vs. Judge. Viral cafe showdown sparks internet frenzy." Dan sighed, shaking his head with a wry smile. Just another day in America. By the end of the day, the video of Karen's outburst had gone viral across multiple platforms. Memes, hashtags, and parody videos flooded the internet. Karen vs. Judge trended on Twitter, and clips of Dan's calm responses became a symbol of stoic humor in the face of chaos. Karen, on the other hand, found herself at the center of a digital storm. Her face became a meme. Her words were quoted mockingly, and even late-night talk show hosts made jokes about the incident. Despite her attempts to defend herself online, the overwhelming public opinion turned against her. As for Dan, he returned to his life with little fanfare. The incident became a minor footnote in his day, a story to tell his friends over dinner. But for the internet, it was a moment of comedy gold, a reminder that sometimes staying calm and sipping your coffee is the best way to handle the chaos around you.